5. What he had seen was the earth from some high, impossible distance in the sky. Miles up, it seemed. He had seen the shadows of clouds lying upon the earth, floating across it like dreams. He had seen what an eagle might see if one could fly thrice as high as an eagle could. To step through such a door would be to fall, screaming, for what might be minutes, and to end up driving oneself deep into the earth. No, you saw more. He considered it as he sat, stupidly, on the sand in front of the closed door with his wounded hand in his lap. The first faint traceries had appeared above his elbow now. The infection would reach his heart soon enough, no doubt about that. It was a voice of Court in his head. "Listen to me, maggots! Listen for your lives, for that is what it could mean someday. You never see all that you see. One of the things they sent you to me for is to show you what you don't see is what you see. What you don't see when you are scared or frightened or running or fucking. No man sees all that he sees, but before you're Gunslinger, those of you who don't go west that is, you'll see more in one single glance that some men see in a lifetime. And some of what you don't see in that glance, you'll see afterwards, in the eye of your memory. You'll live long enough to remember, that is. Because the difference between seeing and not seeing can be the difference between living and dying." He had seen the earth from this huge height, and it had somehow been more dizzying and distorting than the vision of growth which had come upon him shortly before the end of his time with the man in black, because what he had seen through the door had been no vision, and what little remained of his attention had registered the fact that the land he was seeing was neither desert nor sea, but some green place of incredible lushness, with interstices of water that made him think it was a swamp. But "What little remained of your attention?" the voice Court mimicked savagely. "You saw more." Yes, he had seen white edges. "Bravo, Roland!" Court cried in his mind, and Roland seemed to feel the swat of the hand, calloused hand. He winced. He had been looking through a window. The gunslinger stood, with an effort, reached forward and felt cold and burning lines of thin heat against his palm. He opened the door again. 6. The view he had expected, the view of the earth from some horrendous unimaginable height, was gone. He was looking at words he didn't understand. He almost understood them. It was as if great letters had been twisted. Above the words was a picture of a horseless vehicle, a motor car of sort which had supposedly filled the world before it moved on. Suddenly he thought of the things Jake said when at the way station, the gunslinger had hypnotized him. This horseless vehicle with a woman wearing a fur stole laughing beside it could be whatever had run Jake over in that strange other world. This is that other world, the gunslinger thought. Suddenly the view, it did not change, it moved. The gunslinger wavered on his feet, feeling vertigo and a touch of nausea. The words and the picture descended, and now he saw an aisle, with a double row of seats on the far side. A few were empty, but there were men in most of them, men in strange dress. He supposed they were suits, but he had never seen any like them before. The thing around their necks could likewise be ties or cravats, but he had seen none like these either, and so, as far as he could tell, none of them were armed. He saw no dagger nor sword, let alone a gun. What kind of trusting sheep were these? Some read papers covered with tiny words broken here and there with pictures, while others wrote on papers with pens of a sort the gunslinger had never seen. But the pens mattered little to him. It was the paper. He lived in a world where paper and gold were valued in rough equivalency. He had never seen so much paper in his life. Even now one of the men tore a sheet from the yellow pad which lay upon his lap and crumpled it into a ball, although he had only written on top half of one side and not on all on the other. The gunslinger was not too sick to feel a twinge of horror and outrage at such unnatural profligacy. Beyond the men there was a curved white wall and a row of windows. A few of these were covered by some sort of shutters, but he could see blue sky beyond others. Now a woman approached the doorway, a woman wearing what looked like a uniform, but of no sort Roland had ever seen. It was bright red, and part of it was pants. He could see the place where her legs became her crotch. This was nothing he had ever seen on a woman who was not undressed. She came so close to the door that Roland thought she would walk through, and he blundered back a step, lucky not to fall. She looked at him with the practiced solicitude of a woman who is at once a servant but no one's mistress but her own. This did not interest the gunslinger. What interested him was that her expression never changed. It was not the way you expected a woman, anybody for that matter, to look at a dirty, swaying, exhausted man with revolvers crisscrossed on his hips, a blood-soaked rag wrapped around his right hand, and jeans which looked as if they had been worked on the same kind of buzzsaw. "Would you like?" the woman in red asked. There was something more, but the gunslinger didn't understand exactly what it was. Food or drink, he thought. That red cloth, it was not cotton. Silk? It looked like silk, but... "Gin," a voice answered. The gunslinger understood that. Suddenly, he understood much more. It wasn't a door. It was eyes. Insane as it might seem, he was looking at part of a carriage that flew through the sky. He was looking through someone's eyes. Whose? But he knew. He was looking through the eyes of the prisoner. Chapter 2. Eridine 1. As if to confirm this idea, mad as it was, what the gunslinger was looking at through the doorway suddenly rose and slid sidewards. The view turned, that feeling of vertigo again, a feeling of standing still on a plate with wheels under it, a plate with hands he could not see move this way and that. And then the aisle was flowing past the edges of the doorway. He passed a place where several women, all dressed in the same red uniforms, stood. This was a place of steel things, and he would have liked to make the moving view stop in spite of his pain and exhaustion so he could see what the steel things were, machines of some sort. One looked a bit like an oven. The army woman he had already seen was pouring the gin which the voice had requested. The bottle she poured from was very small. It was glass. The vessel she was pouring it into looked like glass, but the gunslinger didn't think it actually was. What the doorway showed had moved along before he could see more. There was another of those dizzying turns, and he was looking at a metal door. There was a lightened sign on a small oblong. This word the gunslinger could read. "Vacant," it said. The view slid down a little. A hand entered it from the right of the door the gunslinger was looking through and grasped the knob of the door the gunslinger was looking at. He saw the cuff of a blue shirt, slightly pulled back to reveal crisp curls of black hair, long fingers, a ring around one of them, with a jewel set into it that might have been a ruby or a fire dim or a piece of trumpery trash. The gunslinger rather thought it was this last. It was too big and too vulgar to be real. The metal door swung open and the gunslinger was looking into the strangest privy he had ever seen. It was all metal. The edges of the metal door flowed past the edges of the door on the beach. The gunslinger heard the sound of it being closed and latched. He was spared another of those giddy spins, so he supposed the man, through his eyes he was watching, must have reached behind himself to lock himself in. Then the view did turn. Not all the way around, but half, and he was looking into a mirror, seeing a face he had seen once before on a tarot card. The same dark eyes and spill of dark hair. The face was calm but pale, and in his eyes through which he saw now reflected back at him, Roland saw some of the dread and horror of that baboon-ridden creature on the tarot card. The man was shaking. "He's sick, too." Then he remembered North, the weed-eater in Tull. He thought of the oracle. "A demon has infested him." The gunslinger suddenly thought he might know what heroin was after all. Something like the devil grass. A trifle upsetting, isn't he? Without thought, with the simple resolve that had made him the last of them all, the last to continue marching on and on long after Cuthbert and the others had died or given up, committed suicide or treachery, or simply recanted the whole idea of the tower, with the single-minded and incurious resolve that had driven him across the desert and all the years before the desert in the wake of the man in black, the gunslinger stepped through the doorway. 2. Eddie ordered a gin and tonic. Maybe not such a good idea to be going into New York Customs drunk, and he knew once he got started he would just keep going on, but he had to have something. "When you get down, you can't find the elevator," Henry had told him once. "You go to do it in any way you can, even if it's only with a shovel." Then, after he'd given his order and the stewardess had left, he started to feel like he was maybe going to vomit. Not for sure going to vomit, only maybe, but it was better to be safe. Going through customs with a pound of pure cocaine under each armpit, with gin on your breath, was not so good. Going through customs that way, with puke drying on your pants, would be a disaster. So better to be safe. The feeling would probably pass, it usually did, but better to be safe. Trouble was, he was going cold turkey. Cool, not cold. More words of wisdom from the great sage and eminent junkie Henry Dean. They had been sitting on the penthouse balcony of the Regency Tower, not quite the nod, but edging towards it. The sun warm on their faces, though up so good. Back in the good old days when Eddie had just started to snort the stuff and Henry himself had yet to pick up his first needle. "Everybody talks about going cold turkey," Henry said, "but before you get there you gotta go cool turkey." And Eddie, stoned out of his mind, had cackled madly, because he knew exactly what Henry was talking about. Henry, however, had not so much as cracked a smile. "In some ways, cool turkey's worse than going cold turkey," Henry said. "At last, when you make it cold turkey, you know you're gonna puke. You know you're gonna shake. You know you're gonna sweat. Until it feels like you're drowning in it. Cool turkey is like the curse of expectation." Eddie remembered asking Henry what you called it when a needle freak, which, in those dim days, which must have been all of 16 months ago, they had both of them solemnly assured themselves they would never become, got a hot shot. "You call that baked turkey," Henry had replied promptly, and then had looked surprised, the way a person does when he said something that turned out to be a lot funnier than he actually thought it would be, and they looked at each other, and then they were both howling with laughter and clutching at each other. Baked turkey. Pretty funny. Not so funny now. Eddie walked up the aisle, past the galley to the head, checked the sign vacant, and opened the door. "Hey, Henry, oh great sage and eminent junkie big brother. While we're on the subject of our feathered friends, you want to hear my definition of cooked goose? That's when the custom guy at Kennedy's decides there's something a little funny about the way you look. Or it's one of those days when they got the dogs with the PhD noses out there instead of at Port Authority, and they all start to bark and pee all over the floor, and it's you they're all just about strangling themselves on their cook chains trying to get to. And after the custom guys toss all your luggage, they take you into a little room and ask you if you don't mind taking off your shirt, and you say, "Yeah, I sure would. I'd mind like hell. I picked up a little cold down in the Bahamas and the air conditioning in here is real high and I'm afraid it might turn into pneumonia." And they say, "Oh, is that so? Do you always sweat like that when the air conditioning is too high, Mr. Dean?" You do. "Well, excuse us all to hell. Now do it." And you do it. And they say, "Maybe you better take off your t-shirt too, because you look like maybe you got some kind of a medical problem, buddy. Those bulges under your pits look like maybe they could be some kind of lymphatic tumors or something," and you don't even bother to say anything else. It's like a center fielder who doesn't even bother to chase the ball when it's hit a certain way. He just turns around and watches it go into the upper deck, because when it's gone, it's gone. So you take off your t-shirt and hey, look there, you're some lucky kid. Those aren't tumors, unless they're what you might call tumors under the corpus of society. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Those things look like more a couple of baggies held there with scotch-scrapping tape. And by the way, don't worry about that smell, son. That's just goose. It's cooked. He reached behind him and pulled the locking knob. The lights in the head brightened. The sound of the motors was a soft drone. He turned towards the mirror, waiting to see how bad he looked, and suddenly a terrible, pervasive feeling swept over him, a feeling of being watched. "Hey, come on, quit it," he thought uneasily. "You're supposed to be the most unparanoid guy in the world. That's why they sent you. That's why." But it suddenly seemed those were not his own eyes in the mirror, not Eddie Dean's hazel, almost green eyes that had melted so many hearts and allowed him to part so many pretty set of legs during the last third of his 21 years. Not his eyes, but those of a stranger. Not hazel, but a blue, the color of fading Levi's. Eyes were chilly, precise, unexpected marvels of calibration. Bombardier eyes. Reflected in them he saw, clearly saw, a seagull swooping down over a breaking wave and snatching something from it. He had time to think. What in God's name is this shit? And then he knew it wasn't going to pass. He was going to throw up after all. In the half second before he did, in the half second that went on looking into the mirror, he saw those blue eyes disappear. But before that happened, there was suddenly the feeling of being two people, of being possessed, like the little girl in The Exorcist. Clearly he felt a new mind inside his own mind, and heard the thought, not as his own thoughts, but more like a voice on a radio. "I've come through. I'm in the sky carriage." There was something else, but Eddie didn't hear it. He was too busy throwing up into the basin as quickly as he could. When he was done, before he had even wiped his mouth, something happened which had never happened to him before. For one frightening moment there was nothing, only a blank interval, as if a single line of column of newsprints had been neatly and completely inked out. "What is this?" Eddie thought helplessly. "What the hell is this shit?" Then he had to throw up again, and maybe that was just as well. Whatever you might say against it, regurgitation had at least this much in its favor. As long as you were doing it, you couldn't think of anything else. 3. "I've come through. I'm in the sky carriage," the gunslinger thought, and a second later, "He sees me in the mirror." Roland pulled back, did not leave, but pulled back, like a child retreating to the furthest corner of a very long room. He was inside the sky carriage. He was also inside the man who was not himself, inside the prisoner. In that first moment, when he had been close to the front, it was the only way he could describe it, he had been more than inside, he had almost been the man. He felt the man's illness, whatever it was, and sensed that the man was about to retch. Roland understood that if he had needed to, he could take control of this man's body. He would suffer his pains, would be ridden by whatever demon ape rode him, but if he needed, and he could. Or he could stay back here, unnoticed. When the prisoner's fit of vomiting had passed, the gunslinger leaped forward, and this time all the way in front. He understood very little about this strange situation, and to act in a situation one does not understand is to invite the most terrible of consequence. But there were two things he needed to know, and he needed to know them so desperately that needing outweighed any consequences that might arise. Was the door he had come through from his own world still there? And if it was his physical self still there, collapsed, unattended, perhaps dying or already dead, with his self to go unthinkingly running lungs and heart and nerves? Even if his body still lived, it might only continue to do so until night fell. Then the lobstrosity would come out to ask their questions and look for sure dinners. He snapped the head, which was for a moment his head, around in a fast backward glance. The door was still there, still behind him. It stood open in his own world, its hinges buried in the steel of this peculiar privy. And yes, there he lay, Roland, the last gunslinger, lying on his side, his bound right hand on his stomach. "I'm breathing," Roland thought. "I'll have to go back and move. But there are other things to do first." Things. He let go of the prisoner's mind and retreated, watching, waiting to see if the prisoner knew he was there or not. 4. After the vomiting stopped, Eddie remained bent over the basin, eyes tightly closed. Blank there for a second. Don't know what it was. Did I look around? He groped for the faucet and ran cool water, eyes still closed. He splashed it all over his cheeks and brow. When it could be avoided no longer, he looked up into the mirror again. His own eyes looked back at him. There were no alien voices in his head, no feeling of being watched. "You had a momentary fugue, Eddie," the great sage and eminent junkie advised him. "A not uncommon phenomenon in one who's going cool turkey." Eddie glanced at his watch. An hour and a half to New York. The plane was scheduled to land at 4:05 EDT, but it was really going to be high noon. Showdown time. He went back to his seat. His drink was on the divider. He took 2 sips, and the stew came back to him to ask if he could do anything else for him. He opened his mouth to say no, and then there was another of those odd, blank moments. "I'd like something to eat, please," the gunslinger said through Eddie Dean's mouth. "We'll be serving a hot snack and I'm really starving though," the gunslinger said with perfect truthfulness. "Anything at all, even a popkin." "Popkin?" The army woman frowned at him, and the gunslinger suddenly looked into the prisoner's mind. Sandwich. The word was as distant as the murmur in a conch shell. "A sandwich even," the gunslinger said. The army woman looked doubtful. "Well, I have some tuna fish." "That would be fine," the gunslinger said, although he had never heard of tutor fish in his life. Beggars could not be choosers. "You do look a little pale," the army woman said. "I thought maybe it'd be air sickness." "Pure hunger." She gave him a professional smile. "I'll see what I can rustle up." Rustle, the gunslinger thought dazedly. In his own world, to rustle was slang verb meaning to take a woman by force. Never mind. Food would come. He had no idea if he could carry it back through the doorway to his body, which needed it so badly. But one thing at a time. One thing at a time. Rustle, he thought, and Eddie Dean's head shook, as if in disbelief. Then, the gunslinger retreated again. Thank you guys for sitting down with another part of Majin reading the Dark Tower, Drawing of the Three. I have forgotten how fun this book is. I've read it a while back and I have forgotten how fun this book is, and I hope you guys are enjoying it. I will say this, Eddie Dean's voice might change through the next chapter because I can't possibly do a New York accent. It's gonna be hard, but I'm gonna try to give him a unique voice. I don't even want to think about further voices in this book, because compared to the Gunslinger that we've already read, which had a very few major characters and a lot of little characters that don't matter, this book has a lot of characters and a lot of recurring characters, and it's gonna be hard to voice them all, but hopefully we'll get through that. And with that being said, hopefully you'll meet us tomorrow and to see what happens with Roland on this airplane, on this sky carriage. Long days and pleasant nights, listener.